right, great. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. So thank you for the introduction, Chip. Like you said, I am a faculty in the Department of Crop, Soil, and Environmental Sciences. So I teach basic soils and soil fertility classes here at Auburn, but I'm really glad to share information about cover crops anytime I get the opportunity because that's where my research program is focused. And although I primarily work with row crops, a lot of the principles that we use in cover crop management are the same regardless of the system that you're working in. And so today we can't go through every cover crop scenario, but I at least want to provide you with some tools that you can use in order to explore cover crops further in your own vegetable systems. So I have to start by talking about the functions of soil because when we're growing cover crops, it's really all about improving the soil and making it more productive for the future. So soil does a lot for us. And we all think about soil as supporting our plants for food and fiber and energy. And that's kind of one of the most essential functions of soil on planet Earth. But it's also really important for filtering our water, providing a habitat for living organisms, sequestering carbon, and providing support for buildings and infrastructure. So we don't want to treat it like dirt. We want to protect it and build it for the future. And I like to share this quote from George Washington Carver that says, whenever the soil is rich, the people flourish physically and economically. And whenever the soil is wasted, the people are wasted. A poor soil produces only a poor people. So we know that, especially in the 1800s, early 1900s, there were a lot of farming practices that significantly degraded the land, really intensive and frequent tillage that disrupted soil organic matter and decreased soil health. So we want to use practices to help build soil health. So when we, as soil scientists, talk about soil health, we're really talking about the continued capacity of a soil to function. And that's those functions that I mentioned at the beginning in terms of supporting plant growth, but also filtering water, sequestering carbon. And that allows soil to function as a living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And soil health is really the intersection of many different properties. And as soil scientists, we often divide those into chemical, physical, and biological properties. So if you're thinking about your own land, chemical properties, that would include things like soil pH and nutrient content of the soil. Physical properties might include things like soil compaction or soil structure, what we often call soil tilth. And then biological properties, think about the fact that in one handful of topsoil, there's more living organisms, fungi, and bacteria than there are human beings on planet Earth, which is pretty wild to think about. So those different organisms, fungi and bacteria in soil, they're performing so many essential functions to support plant growth is one of their functions. So they help cycle nutrients in the soil, cycle carbon, and that can be really important. So where the three of these categories of soil properties really come together is soil organic matter. So soil organic matter is really the central property in terms of improving soil health, because when we improve soil organic matter, we're often improving our chemical properties, our physical properties, our biological properties, because organic matter, it allows us to improve soil structure, which helps us to improve the amount of water that can infiltrate into the soil and also be stored in the soil. Also, it's a source of nutrients. So as organic matter is broken down by soil organisms, it releases nutrients. And then soil organic matter is carbon containing, and most of the organisms that live in soil need carbon as their energy source. So it's really a food that helps support those bacteria and fungi. Also, some of the larger organisms in soil as well. A lot of people think of earthworms as a sign of soil health because that's an indicator that organic matter is high enough that those earthworms can support ourselves. So earthworms are just one example of beneficial organisms in the soil. But again, there's millions of types of bacteria and fungi that are performing essential functions as well. So there's some long-term practices that we can use to conserve soil and improve soil health in the long term. And they can really be broken down into 3 types of practices. Number 1, disturb soil less. So where we can, we want to reduce tillage because that helps us to protect the organic matter that's in the soil, prevent it from being degraded rapidly. We also want to keep soil covered. That's what we're talking about today, cover crops, in order to keep a cover on the soil. And instead of having erosion, I don't know about y'all, but the thunderstorms were quite severe in Auburn last night. And when you think about these strong storms where we have really high rainfall in a short period of time, that soil is so vulnerable to loss. And, you look at this picture on the left-hand side with soil being lost into a drainage ditch that's eventually going to end up in a stream and in a river and a larger body of water. We can't get that soil back once we lose it. So keeping the soil covered is really important for both protecting the organic matter and topsoil that we have in the field already, and protecting the nutrients that are in the soil already, but also building organic matter and building soil in the long term. And then also we want to increase biodiversity. And so cover crops are another way that we do that as well. We know that crop rotation, including rotation with cover crops, can help us, break pests and disease cycles, and provide some diverse organic materials for those bacteria and fungi in soil to thrive on. So these principles, and cover crops is tied to all of them, help us to improve soil health in the long term. So cover crops, when we use them, especially in sync with reduced soil tillage, they perform a lot of different functions to help build soil health. So we know at minimum, cover crops, we want to use them to protect soil from erosion. Here's another picture where a large storm has kind of washed out the work that a farmer had just done to plant peanuts, and then a big rainfall came and disturbed the soil and created erosion. But also we can use cover crops if managed properly to improve soil moisture, increase organic matter storage, suppress weeds, improve water infiltration, provide supplemental nitrogen, scavenge nutrients, and break up soil compaction. So different cover crops are going to be more beneficial for certain functions. So for example, if we look at the benefit of suppressing weed growth or conserving soil moisture, for those 2 benefits, we really want to have a long lasting residue on the soil surface. So something like rye or oats or sorghum Sudan grass, if we're talking about a summer cover crop, those have a high amount of carbon compared to nitrogen. And because of that, they last on the soil surface for a very long time. And that helps us to suppress weeds and conserve soil moisture. If we're talking about providing supplemental nitrogen, then we'd want to plant a legume cover crop in order to have that association of the plant with bacteria that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, and then add to the soil nitrogen pool and hopefully provide a benefit to the subsequent crop that you're growing in terms of nitrogen. So there can be some crop specific considerations. And there's also some specific challenges that we have to address, adding seed and management. Sometimes it's increased labor, sometimes it's increased herbicide cost in order to implement cover crops. So, these are other considerations to make. Also timing of cover crop planting, the timing of termination. So we want to make sure that our cover crops fit well within our cash crop systems, vegetable crop systems, in order to maximize benefit. There's also some challenges that we have to building soil health here in our climate in Alabama. In Alabama, we have a lot of coarse textured soils, so sandy soils, and it can be a little bit harder to build organic matter in our soil types compared to regions with higher clay content. Similarly, our climate, it's hot and humid, and that encourages the breakdown of organic matter more quickly, than more northern regions of the United States. So those are some of the things working against us. And so one of the things that I want to talk about today is how we can overcome some of these challenges. So I have this broken down into 5 different sections as we go through this PowerPoint. And considerations that can be made in order to get the most benefit out of your cover crop and overcome some of those challenges. So we're going to start with cover crop selection, then move into cover crop management and cover crop termination, then planting into cover crop residue, and the impacts on soil health. So starting with cover crop selections, these are just some of, excuse me, I'm getting a notification on my computer. Okay. So these are just some of the considerations that we would have when deciding what cover crops to plant. So first off, which cover crop planting dates fit into my system? There's a lot of examples of cover crops that maybe we plant in outside of ideal windows. And because we're planting them outside of the ideal window, then we're not receiving the maximum benefit. So there's some charts that I'm going to show with ideal planting windows so that you can see what might fit into your growing system. Also, what benefits do I want to attain out of my cover crop? So like I mentioned on that previous slide, we'll go ahead and admit. So as I mentioned on that previous slide, certain benefits may be more achieved better with certain cover crops. And then we also want to think about what cash crop is going to follow the cover crop, because what we don't want to do is encourage, for example, nematodes. Okay, we don't want to encourage, if we have an issue with a certain type of nematodes, we do not want to use a cover crop that would stimulate those populations. So we want to make sure that our cash crop is compatible with our cover crop that we're using. Okay, so like I mentioned, we have ideal planting dates for certain cover crops. This is a chart from the Southern Cover Crops Council, which I'm a part of. It's a group of farmers, research scientists, extension from throughout the Southern region, and we work to generate materials related to cover crop management. And so this is showing for some common fall and winter planted cover crops, timing when planting is optimum, which is shown in dark green, and then when it's possible, maybe not optimum, in lighter green colors here. So for example, if we're interested in planting cereal rye, we want to try to get that planted in October, November timeframe. If we start pushing into December, we can still get some growth, but it's going to be a little more risky, and we may not get the desired amount of residue and the desired establishment that we want out of that cover crop. When we look at some of our legumes, again, we want to plant those. For example, crimson clover is a really common one within the Southeast region. So we really want to try to plant that if possible by the end of October, because when we start pushing too late, again, we have a higher chance the weather may not cooperate with us. You know, there's some years where we can plant a crimson clover cover crop in late November and still get a really nice stand in biomass production the following year. But as we move outside of that ideal planting window, our risk of having non-ideal plant biomass or cover crop biomass starts to increase. And then our radishes or brassicas that are common for fall and winter planting, those really like to be planted early. So October, September timeframe is when we want to plant those in order to achieve the maximum benefit. So this is just one example of what can happen when we plant outside of those ideal windows. So we had research in Central and South Alabama to look at cover crop planting dates for daikon radishes. And we had several different varieties of radishes that we grew. And you'll see that when we planted in September, we were getting 7,000 pounds of dry weight above ground biomass per acre. And then once we delayed until mid-October, look how significantly that dropped. When we delayed into November, almost no biomass. So this is going to vary a little bit year to year, but in general, this is why we want to get in those ideal planting windows. So similarly, we have ideal planting windows for if we're planting cover crops for early spring and summer, and then other charts for late summer. Here's some examples here, but you know, just like with the fall and winter planted cover crops, We have ideal planting windows for some of our summer grasses, legumes, and broadleafs as well. I'm going to show you a tool in just a moment that you can use to help narrow down possible cover crop species that might work in your system. And that's going to take into account both planting dates and the benefits that you're trying to achieve. So again, small grains and grasses, these are going to be a really nice cover crop in order to get a level of biomass that we can use to suppress weeds, conserve soil moisture, improve organic matter. They have really prolific root systems. So rye and oat roots, for example, they'll grow 4 or 5 feet deep into the soil. And when they're doing that, they're taking nutrients that were maybe left over from your previous crop. So let's say we had applied nitrogen to tomatoes and not all of that nitrogen was taken up by the tomato plants. There's still nitrogen in the soil. The roots of these covers can scavenge deep into the soil profile, bring that nitrogen back up so that it can be recycled to the next crop. And then these are also good for erosion prevention, water infiltration. Legumes, we want to use those for fixing nitrogen for the subsequent cash crop. This is a picture of sun hemp, a summer legume cover crop that's really good for nitrogen fixation. And then brassicas and other broadleaves can have deep tap roots that help to break up soil compaction and also scavenge those nutrients deeper into the soil profile. So in addition to the type of cover crop, the amount of biomass that we produce has an influence on the benefits that we receive. So even with low levels of biomass, like you can see in this first picture here, we still have a really good ability to protect against erosion and nutrient loss. So it doesn't take a lot of cover on the soil to have a really significant effect on prevention of erosion and runoff. But as we increase the level of biomass, so look at this picture that I'm circling here, this is where we can get more benefits in terms of improving organic matter, suppressing weed growth, conserving soil moisture. So I have a link to a tool here on the Southern Cover Crops Council website. This is a cover crop selector tool, and this has been an effort of the Southern Cover Crop Council and the Northeast Cover Crop Council over the past several years. There's dozens of different scientists that have contributed to this tool, and I'm going to pull this up on my screen. Chip, can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Just wanted to double check before I went any further. So that website that I provided, southerncovercrops.org, we have this cover crop selection tool. And if you go to it, you can log in and create an account so that it remembers your fields. I'm just going to click not now for right now. And what we can do here is pick our state. Click next. And then you can enter an address for, a location of where you're going to be planting your cover crop. So I'm just going to put in an address for one of our research stations where I know I plant cover crops. Okay, and then I'm going to zoom in here. Here's one of my fields where I plant cover crops every year. So I'll just click on that. And that gives me a location. And the reason that we want to pick our location is that this website links to the soil survey data and weather data for that location. So just by putting in my address and selecting my field, it's pulling data about the soil composition. And this particular soil, it is a Dothan fine sandy loam. It's a well-drained soil. It's pulling in weather data, so it knows my approximate precipitation and how frequently it's flooded, because these are all factors that are important for determining what cover crop species might thrive in your area. So then the next part is also really important. So different producers are going to have different goals with their cover crops. So this tool allows you to select your top 3 goals in order of importance, and then it will give you recommendations based on what these goals are. So for example, if one of my major goals is going to be residue to suppress weeds in my following cash crop, but I also want to improve organic matter and build overall soil health. There's one that's related to that. I just gotta find it. Let's say increases soil aggregation or improve soil structure. Then I can set those goals in my own order of importance. And then I can put in a cash crop growing window. So let's say, you know, whatever it is that I'm planting, we're planting in early April, and I'm going to be growing, you know, this could be vegetable crops or whatever it is you're planting. And I'm going to be doing that until, you know, late September, let's say. And you can put in your own cash crop growing window. Then this is going to give you a breakdown of cover crops that may be beneficial in your system. And there's you have to kind of look at a few different factors on this page in order to determine what might work for you. So for example, so first what we want to look at is we have the cover crop name and then how good they are at performing the different goals that we selected. So this tool is saying that winter cereal rye is really good at increasing soil organic matter, producing a residue to suppress weeds, and increasing soil aggregation. Then I can look at the planting window and I see this is where my cash crop is growing. That's why it's in red. That's the cash crop growing window that I selected. And my ideal planting window for the rye is outside of that. So that could be a really good choice for me. If I keep scrolling down, you know, we've got, for example, this would be sorghum, Sudan grass, or sorghum. These are really good at achieving the goals that I want, but they're with the planting window would be within my cash crop planting window. So that's not going to be a good option for me. So I can scroll down and look at the different options and compare them. If you click on specific cover crops, it'll give you a description of the cover, an idea of how they perform in terms of different cover crop goals. It'll give you an idea of the carbon and nitrogen ratio. This can be really important for having a long lasting residue. So if we have a high carbon and nitrogen ratio in something like rye, that residue is not going to break down very quickly. That's why it's good for suppressing winter weeds. Also have some information about environmental tolerances. So is it drought tolerant? Is it flood tolerant? Shade tolerant? This information, you know, we got from the web soil survey. It showed us earlier within the cover crop selector tool. It's also going to give some growth traits, some ideal soil conditions in which it thrives. Rye, I mean, we don't want to have a pH of 4.5 or 5 in our soils for pretty much any row crops that we're growing or vegetable crops, unless it's something like blueberries, for example, that prefers a low pH. But rye is pretty good at being tolerant of soil acidity. So that's something that's particularly interesting about rye. And then for the farmer, this is what's really important, right? The planting information. So it's going to give you a breakdown of the seeding rates, and the seeding rates are going to differ whether you're broadcasting versus drilling. So, you know, 90 to 120 pounds of rye if we're broadcasting per acre, whereas if we're drilling, we could reduce that seeding rate to about 45 to 100 pounds per acre. Drill depth if we're drilling. So this is some good information in terms of practical information that the producer is going to need, ways that we can terminate the cover crop, and then some other comments. So for example, if we've got a cover crop that is maybe susceptible to a particular nematode or resistant to a particular nematode, that might be provided here. If there's certain insects or grazing considerations, kind of just some extra comments that have been provided. So although we can't go through all the different, you know, kind of cover crops today and different benefits that they might achieve, hopefully this tool will give you an additional resource for examining cover crop species and management that would work within your particular growing system. And I would like to add one additional note here that's not covered within the species selector tool, but is something worth looking into. Sometimes not only cover crop species, but also variety can have a really big influence on growth. So these are a couple of pictures that were taken on the same day in March in South Alabama. On the left-hand side, we have an earlier maturing rye variety, and then on the right-hand side, we have a later maturing rye variety. So by the second week of April, these plots looked identical. But this picture that I took in early March, about a month prior, we can see that the
I think we lost Audrey. I think her computer might have had to reboot or something that was happening. So that may be
That was
the
odd. That
issue.
was odd.
Say that again, Ed.
That was odd.
Yeah. Well, it popped up. She had something pop up on her screen about uh
I get the same type of thing and I get confused.
yeah. It popped up on her screen 5-10 minutes ago that it wanted to Auburn wanted to reboot her computer.
Oh.
And anyway, I guess they did. And all. So I hate that. See, if that's what has to happen, it may be several minutes before she gets back on, and she might not get back on and join. I wonder, Dr. Score, if we ought to go on with your presentation or give it 5 minutes.
I'm ready and willing, but if you want to give 5 minutes to see if she gets back on, I'm sure she's trying.
She is.
There she is.
sorry about that. My computer seems very determined to restart right now.
That's all right.
Okay, let me pull up this presentation. I'm where I was. Okay. All right. Is that all good?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you everyone for your patience. So I was saying that variety can have a big importance on cover crop growth as well, and that this picture on the left shows an earlier maturing variety. So this is an additional consideration that you might want to look into once you've selected a cover crop. Look for a little bit of information. There's information on extension websites. You're welcome to contact me on specific varieties that may perform well. This is another picture showing crimson clover, and the one on the left is a variety called AU Sunrise. The one on the right is Dixie. It's the most commonly sold crimson clover variety in the Southeast. And so what you'll notice, the one on the left, we're already, reaching full bloom here on April 7th, whereas the Dixie is still in kind of an earlier bloom stage. And so especially if we're trying to get in early and plant a cash crop, but we want to get a nitrogen benefit, sometimes an earlier maturing variety can benefit us because we get that growth a little bit earlier. We can terminate a little bit earlier and then go ahead and plant our cash crop and hopefully get that full nitrogen benefit out of the legume. So that's a little bit on cover crop selection. Does anyone have any questions or comments up to this point? Okay, I'll keep going. So cover crop management, there's several different ways that, well, there's a lot of different considerations in terms of cover crop management. The first is planting. So are we going to be able to use some kind of drill? No-till drill is going to provide the most uniform stand. But producers may not have this capability. So broadcasting can be done as well. It's fast, and we often have a little bit higher seed cost because we need to increase the seeding rate a little bit in order to get the same establishment. But either one of these is perfectly acceptable. We do want to make sure that we get good seed to soil contact. So, sometimes a light incorporation is necessary in order to get good establishment from a broadcasted seed. So once those cover crops have grown, and I didn't put a note on soil fertility in here, but in terms of cover crop management, most of the cover crops that we grow, we're growing to get, we're growing to benefit the soil. And a lot of times as long as we're maintaining our phosphorus, potassium, and pH according to soil tests for our cash crops, then we're going to get good cover crop establishment for those different nutrients. Now, if we're planting something like a small grain, we may want to add a little bit of nitrogen. Like we often will put out about 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre to cover crops like rye or oats or sorghum Sudan grass in order to get a boost. But a lot of farmers will choose not to do that because it's an extra input cost. So you can still get typically you can still get really nice growth out of rye or other grasses without nitrogen. But if we're trying to shoot for really high biomass because we want to have a thick residue to help suppress weeds or increase soil moisture retention, then a little shot of nitrogen may be helpful in order to stimulate growth and get better biomass production. But once we produce that biomass, timing of termination is your next consideration. We typically recommend terminating a cover crop 2 to 4 weeks prior to planting. And there's a few reasons why. Number one, it can help ensure that we have good soil moisture. So we don't want a cover crop competing with our cash crop for soil moisture. Now, if we have good irrigation, this may not be as much of a consideration. We also want to prevent nitrogen immobilization if we're using small grain. So look at this picture on the left-hand side here. This would be a rye cover crop that's been terminated and it's dried down, and we planted, this is cotton, but we planted into this rye residue. This rye residue, because it's so high in carbon, it can actually tie up nitrogen and make it less available to the next crop. So because of that, if we give that rye residue a little bit of time to degrade before we go into our cash crop, we can prevent that immobilization or tying up of nitrogen. And terminating 2 to 4 weeks ahead of planting can also reduce the risk of insect and disease issues, because when we plant directly into a green cover crop, we refer to that as a green bridge for insects, where insects can just go from the cover crop into the cash crop. So there are certainly producers who are comfortable and can make it work planting a little bit closer to timing, closer to termination. But these are some of the things you need to be on the lookout for if you do that. Make sure that there's not any insect issues and diseases that might become an issue. So in terms of how do we terminate a cover crop, we have a few options here as well. Chemical termination with herbicides is going to be the most widely used option for cover crop termination. And sometimes rolling is done with chemical termination in order to kind of lay down the cover like a mat. So you can see that picture, this picture on the top. This is a roller crimper that's going through the rye that has been terminated with a chemical. Glyphosate is often used in order to chemically terminate a cover crop, but if you have different species, then there can be different considerations there. And I always advise, you can talk to Chip, and if he doesn't know, can talk to the appropriate weed scientist to know the best herbicides in order to burn down a cover crop. The second option is rolling and crimping. And so again, this roller crimper shown in this picture on the upper left-hand corner, this can be a great option for small grain cover crops. And so what this does, it's not actually cutting through the residue, but it is crimping it. And so it's cutting into that, or it's crimping into that vascular tissue, and it's preventing water and nutrients from being able to move through the plant. And so that causes the plant to die. If you are using a roller crimper without chemicals to terminate, then we want to terminate around the soft dough stage. So when that, if we have a small grain like rye or oat, if you look in the seed head and pull out grain, the grain should really feel like a dough. It shouldn't be milky. It should be kind of doughy. And that's a good timing in order to maximize the termination of the cover crop. This method does not work as well for legume cover crops like crimson clover and hairy vetch. You can think about those, they vine, they have thin stems that kind of mat on top of each other. And so the USDA Soil Dynamics Lab here in Auburn has done research and shown that it can take 6 or 7 times of running over your field with a roller crimper in order to actually kill something like hairy vetch. And so it's a little bit more practical for, our small grain cover crops or grass cover crops and even brassica cover crops. But although with those, you're essentially just chopping off the tops of the plants, which also effectively terminates them. And then lastly, mowing and incorporating is another way to deal with cover crop residue. So if you're in an organic system and you don't want to spray chemicals, then this is most often the best option unless you're growing small grains and you can roll and crimp it. And by the way, I should say there's a variety of different roller crimpers out there of all different sizes. Some that are tractor mounted, some that are even push behind. So mowing and incorporating, moving back down here, covers are easier to kill and not come back as weeds if you wait until they've reached maturity before you mow them. And so mowed cover crop residue often is incorporated with tillage, but you don't want to produce more residue. So this is really high residue cover crop here. So if you don't have the equipment to till that residue in, then you might want to avoid mowing and incorporating as a termination method. And then lastly, I want to talk about planting into cover crop residue. So this is the bottom picture. This is a picture of a transplanter, vegetable transplanter that's just been modified to have a sharp coulter in order to plant through cover crop residue. And then it has wheel cleaners in order to kind of brush the residue. As those wheel cleaners are running across the ground, they kind of brush the residue out of the way so that you can get good seed to soil or transplant to soil contact, but while still minimizing soil disturbance. So again, this is a little bit more difficult to find equipment that's already manufactured for no-till. I don't know if anyone else on the call has any suggestions there, but a lot of times equipment can be modified in order to plant through a higher residue cover crop. These are just a couple more pictures. This would be on a larger scale where we're subsoiling through a cover crop residue, and then we'll go behind that and plant. And then here's that vegetable transplanter. You can see that the residue is being cut and then swept away, and then those transplants, they're in a lot of residue, but they still have good soil contact there in order to keep them stable. Okay, so that's a little bit on selecting and managing cover crops. And now I'll quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, try to talk a little bit about the benefits of cover crops. And I'm going to use an example of an experiment that we have here on Auburn University's campus called the old rotation. I think it's important to look at long-term experiments when we're thinking about soil health, because soil health is a long-term investment. It doesn't occur overnight. There's amendments that we can apply to soil, like compost and manures that help to build organic matter, but even still, it's a long-term investment to build. So this is an experiment that has different rotations with cotton, but again, the principles are the same regardless of what your system is. So we have cotton that's been grown with no cover crop and no crop rotation for 128 years. And then we have cotton that's been grown with no rotation, but with a winter cover crop for 120 years. And then there's other treatments that have different crop rotations. But right now, I really just want to focus on with and without a cover crop. So this is what our plots look like around late April or mid-April. We usually terminate our cover crops in mid-April. So this would be pretty soon before cover crop termination. And you can see certain plots, they remain fallow in the winter time, while others get a legume cover crop. In this case, we have a crimson clover cover crop that's growing all winter long. It's protecting the soil surface from erosion, and it's adding organic matter to the soil. And then this is what the cash crops